Hello once again from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson. In 1975, Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe, the author of Things Fall Apart, whose Time magazine obituary in April of 2013 describes him as a literary lion who is called the father of African literature, in a lecture at the University of Massachusetts, described the late 19th and early 20th century author Joseph Conrad as a bloody, later modified to thoroughgoing, racist for his depictions of Africans within the novella Heart of Darkness. Achebe, the death announcement further observed, had once told a writer from the Paris Review, "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." Interestingly, when I read Conrad's Heart of Darkness inspiration for the Francis Ford Coppola 1979 motion picture Apocalypse Now, which has been described as the best action and war film of all time, I have a somewhat different experience of the story, finding it to be more about the depths of the human psyche than any other peripheral issues. To begin, the narrative starts on the deck of a ship anchored on the Thames River in London, which is waiting for the tide to turn so it can set sail, and that city is depicted as being both cast in darkness and the site of a one-time wilderness outpost for the Roman Empire, which is the direct equivalent of the 19th century British perception of Africa as the Dark Continent. Furthermore, judging from the author's biography, it seems to me that Joseph Theodore Conrad Korzeniowski had far more reason to identify with the lion and its hunter, having been born in a Russian-occupied section of Ukraine that had previously been part of Poland before that country's partition during the late 1700s by Austria, Prussia, and Russia. At the age of 5, the future writer was sent with his parents into political exile about 300 miles north of Moscow for a year, although later being allowed to return to Ukraine, where his mother soon died of tuberculosis. Then his father also died by the time Joseph had become 11 years old. Raised under the care of an uncle, in 1875, after studying briefly at the University of Krakow, the 18-year-old young man entered the French Merchant Marine Service, sailed to the West Indies in 1876, helped to smuggle guns into Spain in support of an uprising there, and became involved in a duel as a result of a failed romance, and then joined the English merchant service in 1878 as an ordinary seaman, eventually rising to the rank of first mate, and then earning his own command by the age of 31. Becoming fluent in French and English in addition to his native Polish, Conrad's ocean voyages took him to the Far East and, on one occasion, before retiring in 1884, marrying and settling first in London and then Essex, on an arduous journey up the Congo River. It was during these various expeditions that Joseph Conrad began writing and publishing, eventually producing a body of work that developed over a period of 31 years and included, along with Heart of Darkness, 20 novels such as Lord Jim, An Outcast of the Islands, Typhoon, Nostoroma, The Secret Agent, and Under Western Eyes. In addition to as many as 27 fully developed stories, such as The Secret Sharer and Youth. In a New Yorker article by David Denby titled "The Trouble with Heart of Darkness," it was observed that, in spite of accusations against Heart of Darkness, it was unlikely that the novella would be removed from college reading lists. But since the early 2000s, the inclusion of that work has been shown to have declined by as much as 75%, and when the text is assigned, it is often placed in juxtaposition with Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, its title derived from the Irish nationalist poet William Butler Yeats' The Second Coming, a comparison that it seems could serve to shift the conversation regarding Conrad's work away from the obsessant excesses of manic materialistic 19th century colonialism to genuinely significant but far more contemporary post-colonial issues of cultural realism and race with respect to the etic or emic, outsider or insider, depiction of non-Europeans, including what Achebe states in the second chapter of Things Fall Apart, the gathering of human heads during conflicts, as well as their display and even use for drinking vessels on some traditional African ceremonial occasions. Conrad's narrative, however, expressly provides a condemnation of European colonial exploitation of the world and of materialism as a form of madness that is the horror realized by the maniacal ivory trader Mr. Kurtz in advance of his death when being brought out from the depths of a remote jungle outpost where he'd become a kind of messianic ruler. In the opening chapter, Conrad has the primary narrator, Sea Captain Charles Marlowe, observe the conquest of the earth by Western Europeans, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. Then, throughout the novella, it is the absurd behavior of the pilgrims, agents for European trading companies, which is most often criticized, Conrad characterizing them as devoting their time to backbiting and intriguing against each other, and perpetually engaging in totally pointless activities. Charlie Marlowe is also the primary narrator in Joseph Conrad's full-length novel, Lord Jim, published the same year as Heart of Darkness, 1899, and dealing with a disgraced sailor who comes to find both paradise and personal redemption, being given the title Lord by the inhabitants of a distant Southeast Asian outpost far away from Western civilization. And then Marlowe serves the same narrative function in the book Chance, published 14 years later in 1913. What I find interesting is the contrast between the environments of Heart of Darkness and Lord Jim, and the fact that it is the motivations of these stories' white central characters which appear to make their surroundings either a heaven or a hell on earth. Also, in the 1909 short story, The Secret Sharer, written by Conrad for Harper's Magazine, an unnamed sea captain taking on a new command conceals in his cabin a sailor from another ship who had killed an officer in self-defense, charting a course that will allow the fugitive to swim to a remote tropical island where he can have the opportunity to begin a new life within an idyllic setting, somewhat like the mutineers from the British naval ship Bounty. What both Lord Jim and the Secret Sharer have in common is that the natural world outside of Western civilization offers a promise of sanctuary. In Heart of Darkness, however, it's the moral decay and unrestrained avarice brought about through materialistic imperialism as represented to its most extreme by Kurtz, which transforms a tropic environment from Eden into a human skulls mounted on fence posts surrounded encampment at the center of an earthly form of hell. In the story he tells, Marlowe criticizes as well as participates within the cruelty of colonialism. During his journey into the African jungle and the Congo River, Marlowe witnesses the brutal dehumanization of the region's indigenous population and then equally engages within it through the objectification of the natives as other in comparison to himself, often in the most pejorative of terms, while also remaining distinct from the colonizing pilgrims and the materialistic lust represented by Kurtz, even occasionally identifying with the basic humanity of the Africans who he sees from the deck of the riverboat as he guides it into the trackless depths of their world. As a result, the story becomes increasingly complex in terms of its ethical ambiguities and the many absurdities which are encountered within it. This complexity is also demonstrated by the way in which the story is told, as a narration encased within a narration, presented by an unidentified storyteller, perhaps Conrad himself, but also possibly not the author in his own voice, who then relates what he describes as the tale of one of Marlowe's inconclusive experiences. This kind of lack of clarity is represented in the ominous atmosphere enshrouding London at the beginning of the story and later in the jungle along the Congo, becomes one of the work's dominant features, raising such questions as whether or not anything can be trusted and, of course, what motivated Kurtz. Was it merely greed, or was material acquisition rather a means to an end, the attaining of sufficient means to obtain the approval of his intended fiancé's family as a way of overcoming its members' objection to her marriage with someone who otherwise appeared to lack financial prospects? Further enigmatic elements are established with the description of Marlowe himself as he resembled an idol in the pose of a Buddha preaching in European clothes and without a lotus flower, who explained that as a child he'd had a passion for maps and developed a longing to visit the blank spaces on Earth, particularly places scattered about the equator, the biggest and most blank being one in Central Africa containing a mighty river resembling an immense snake, uncoiled with its head in the sea, its body at rest afar over a curving course in a vast country, and its tail lost in the depths of the land. It was there that Marlowe would encounter Kurtz, an artist, a progeny, an emissary of pity and science in progress, who had initially been dedicated to weaning the Dark Continent's ignorant millions from their horrid ways before ultimately adopting them at their most extreme for himself. In order to fulfill his intentions, having been charmed by the snake of the Congo River, Marlowe needed to enlist the assistance of women, specifically an aunt, who arranged through the wife of a very high personage to secure a position for him as a replacement of a captain who had been killed with a spear by the son of an African chief during a quarrel about a pair of 2 black chickens. Gaining his freshwater sailor appointment following an interview at a trading company office in a European city described as a whited sepulchre where a pair of old women sat knitting black wool like 2 fates from classical mythology, Marlowe observed, "It's queer how out of touch with truth women are, living in a world of their own, while men," he claimed, "have needed to encounter realities well beyond the neatly ordered tea and frosted cake civilities of female imagination." Upon arrival at the company's African headquarters, after witnessing a French warship firing its cannons into a grove of trees for no discernible reason, and then seeing a clearing, the gloomy circle of some inferno, he calls it, where overworked natives apparently had withdrawn to die, Marlowe learned that the craft he was supposed to command, a 2-penny, half-penny river steamboat with a penny whistle attached, had been sunk, and that he'd need to devote 3 months to its repair before even beginning into the heart of darkness he had seen on the map during his youth. Eventually, becoming able to venture along the serpentine river deep into the jungle, as though set off for the center of the earth and the darkest part of the human psyche. When approaching the interior encampment, the ship was attacked, and its capable African helmsman killed by a spear, Marlowe pushing the man's body into a watery grave before it could be devoured by a starving group of cannibals he'd taken on as a crew for the intended journey. Only learning later from a harlequin-like Russian trader encountered at the outpost that Kurtz, who'd become a godlike leader to the local inhabitants, had himself ordered the attack on the steamboat. Discovering Kurtz to have become extremely ill, Marlowe takes him on board the boat and begins to transport him away from the trading encampment when there's another attack, this time led by a female warrior, possibly Kurt's lover, savage and superb, wild-eyed and magnificent, who remains alone on the riverbank when the shrill sound of the craft's steam whistle frightens off her followers just before Kurtz utters his final words, "The horror, the horror." Continuing to withdraw from the jungle with flies that did not sting but stabbed, Marlowe brings with him a book that he had found about seamanship with marginal notes written in code, and a manuscript that Kurtz had created for the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs, at the end of which his author had scrawled the postscript, "Exterminate the brutes." Then, returning once again through the series of concentric circles which had comprised the arc of his journey into the depths of the jungle and unrestrained madness, Marlowe revisits the whited sepulchre city of his departure, and, although having previously stated, "I hate, detest, and can't bear a lie, when asked by Kurt's intended, tells the young woman in mourning that the final words which her dearly departed fiancé had spoken before his death were not the horror, but rather her name, demonstrating, in my mind at any rate, that civility, and therefore the fragilely delicate illusion of civilization, is based upon a lie. Literary critic Harold Bloom has observed that Heart of Darkness, at only 40,000 words in length, has been analyzed more than any other work of literature studied in colleges and universities. And it has also been the inspiration not just for Apocalypse Now, but for television versions of the story featuring Rodney McDowell and Boris Karloff, and then Tim Roth and John Malkovich, and even a science fiction film titled Ad Astra starring Brad Pitt and Tommy Lee Jones, not to mention video games, and of course the epigram of the poet T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men, Mr. Kurtz, he dead, a penny for the old guy. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.